The World Bank is an international development organization owned by 187 countries. Its role is to reduce poverty by lending money to the governments of its poorer members to improve their economies and to improve the standard of living of their people. The bank is also one of the world's largest research centers in development. It has specialized departments that use this knowledge to advise countries in areas like health, education, nutrition, finance, justice, law, and the environment. Another part of the bank, the World Bank Institute, offers training to government and other officials in the world through local research and teaching institutions. How the World Bank was established. The World Bank was established in 1944 to help rebuild Europe and Japan after World War II. Its official name was the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD. When it first began operations in 1946, it had 38 members. Today, most of the countries in the world are members. Do we need a World Bank? Without a place like the World Bank from which to borrow money, the world's poorest countries would have few, if any, ways to finance much-needed development projects. The projects are essential to helping people become educated, live healthy lives, get jobs, and contribute as active citizens. How the World Bank is organized. The World Bank has created new organizations within itself that specialize in different activities. All these organizations together are called the World Bank Group. It consists of IBRD lends to low and middle income countries. International Development Association, IDA, lends to low-income countries. International Finance Corporation, IFC, lends to the private sector. Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, MIGA, encourages private companies to invest in foreign countries, and International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes, ICSID, helps private investors and foreign countries work out differences when they don't agree. How decisions are made. The bank is run like a giant cooperative, where its members are shareholders and is operated for the benefit of those using its services. The number of shares a country has is based roughly on the size of its economy. The United States is the largest single shareholder, followed by Japan, Germany, the United Kingdom, and France. The rest of the shares are divided among the other member countries. A board of governors represents the bank's government shareholders. Generally, these governors are country ministers, such as ministers of finance or ministers of development. The governors are the ultimate policy makers in the World Bank. They meet once a year at the bank's annual meetings. At the annual meetings, all of the banks and International Monetary Fund (IMF) governors decide how best to address global development issues and decide what the world should focus on in the upcoming year and near future, to help reduce poverty in the world. Since the governors meet only once a year, they give specific duties to their executive directors, who work on site at the bank. Every member government is represented by an executive director. The 5 largest shareholders, France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom and the United States, appoint an executive director each, while other member countries are represented by 19 executive directors. The bank's 24 executive directors oversee the bank's business, including approving loans and guarantees, new policies, the administrative budget, country assistance strategies, and borrowing and financial decisions. Loans and the World Bank. The bank lends money to middle-income countries at interest rates lower than the rates on loans from commercial banks. In addition, the bank lends money at no interest to the poorest developing countries, those that often cannot find other sources of loans. Countries that borrow from the bank also have a much longer period to repay their loans than commercial banks allow and don't have to start repaying for several years. Source of money. The bank borrows the money it lends. It has good credit because it has large, well-managed financial reserves. This means it can borrow money at low interest rates from capital markets all over the world to then lend money to developing countries on very favorable terms. The bank's financial reserves come from several sources, from funds raised in the financial markets, from earnings on its investments, from fees paid in by member countries, from contributions made by members, particularly the wealthier ones, and from borrowing countries themselves when they pay back their loans. The bank lends only a portion of the money needed for a project. The borrowing country must get the rest from other sources or use its own funds. Eventually, since the country has to pay back its loans, it ends up paying for most, if not all, of the project itself. World Bank loans help countries supply safe drinking water, build schools and train teachers, increase agricultural productivity, manage forests and other natural resources, build and maintain roads, railways, and ports, extend telecommunications networks, generate and distribute energy, expand healthcare, modernize. The bank also tries to encourage investment and lending by countries, companies, and private investors. It also lends money to hire industry experts to help countries to reshape their economies to make them more efficient and productive. Money isn't the only type of support that the bank provides. Often, it is the advice and experience the bank's staff brings to a project or the environmental and social standards it applies that are also important. How does a project work? A project begins when a country identifies a need, develops a plan, and asks the bank for a loan. Experts from the borrowing country and the World Bank then study the plan carefully. Bank staff carefully review the project and ask questions like, will the project help the country's economy? Will it benefit the poorest people and increase economic opportunities for women? What impact would it have on the environment, both now and in the future? Can other funding sources be found? Will the country be able to maintain the project once funding ends? Negotiations take place on how to implement the strategy. Once an agreement is reached, and the loans are approved, work can begin. The bank carefully monitors progress and pays out the loan in installments. Assessing the effect of projects the bank supports is essential in developing countries. Resources are scarce and must be used where they can have the largest effect. Monitoring helps project managers know if programs are reaching the people they are aimed at or if these programs are ineffective and wasteful. Monitoring and assessment also provide information and data on which future projects are designed. The World Bank Group is a family of 5 multilateral institutions focused on economic development whose overarching mission is global poverty reduction. Established by Western powers in 1944, the World Bank was originally tasked with rebuilding the economies of post-war Europe. Almost 80 years later, it has funded more than 12,000 projects and expanded its reach into nearly all of the world's developing countries. Since June 2023, the bank has been led by former MasterCard CEO Ajay Banga, the first Indian American to lead the institution. But the long-standing tradition of U.S. leadership of the World Bank has led some observers to argue that the bank is too dominated by the West, particularly given the bank's primary focus on the developing world and the rise of alternative institutions. Others suggest the bank has outlived its usefulness altogether, citing the increase in private capital flows available to developing countries. Supporters of the bank contend that it contributes to global economic development as an arbiter of best practices. When was the World Bank founded? The World Bank, along with its sister organization, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, was created at the Bretton Woods Conference in New Hampshire in 1944. The Allied powers, led by the United States and the United Kingdom, sought to restore European prosperity and prevent a recurrence of the economic malaise of the 1920s and 1930s, which helped fuel the rise of totalitarianism. The IMF, which by tacit agreement would be led by a European, was charged with managing the global regime of exchange rates and balance of payments. The World Bank, to be led by an American, would provide member countries with post-war reconstruction loans. While the IMF would focus on firefighting immediate macroeconomic problems, the World Bank would concentrate on the longer task of development. In recent decades, the bank's primary focus has shifted from partnering with middle-income nations on growth-related programs and trade liberalization toward global poverty alleviation. These efforts take place in the world's poorest countries, particularly those in Africa and in middle-income countries, such as China and India, where the majority of the world's poor reside. In 2013, the bank set a goal to end extreme poverty, experienced by people living on $2.15 or less per day, by 2030. World Bank officials have since said that the lender will not succeed in that time frame. In 2022, senior bank officials wrote that it is now clear that the global goal of ending extreme poverty by 2030 will not be achieved absent a history-defying rate of progress over the next 8 years. Other priorities for the bank include transnational issues such as climate change and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as reconstruction in post-conflict nations. What does the World Bank do? The World Bank Group is composed of 5 separate institutions: the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, the International Development Association, IDA, the International Finance Corporation, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, and the International Center for Settlement of Investment Disputes. Each of these agencies is owned and operated as a cooperative by its member countries. Together, the IBRD and the IDA are commonly referred to as the World Bank. As of 2023, the bank's 6 largest shareholders out of its 189 members are the United States, Japan, China, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. Ultimate policy-making authority at the bank rests with the Board of Governors, mostly made up of senior finance or development officials from member countries. The Board of Governors, in turn, delegates certain powers to the Board of Directors, which is composed of 25 executives and the World Bank's president. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Delegates at Bretton Woods established the IBRD in 1944 as the World Bank's charter institution. Through loans, guarantees, and other services, the IBRD works with middle-income and credit-worthy low-income nations to fight poverty. Projects span the globe and include digitizing health systems in Belarus, reducing air pollution in Colombia, and generating solar power in Pakistan. The International Development Association. As a complement to the IBRD, the IDA was established in 1960 to promote broad-based development work in the world's poorest countries by offering interest-free credits and grants. The IDA currently considers 75 countries, including 39 in Africa, eligible for its programs, which focus on education, health, and sustainable environmental practices. What do the World Bank's proponents say? The World Bank has been revered by many as the preeminent brain trust in development economics. You could certainly find brilliant development economists outside the bank, writes CFR Sebastian Malaby in his book The World's Banker, but nobody could match the bank's concentration of talent. As a result, he says, the bank's annual World Development Report often establishes the accepted wisdom on any given development topic. The World Bank has had several successful interventions, in the estimation of many observers. With bank support, Bosnia went from being a war-torn, low-income economy in 1995 to becoming an upper-middle-income economy today. The World Bank also provided almost half of the public funding of South Korea in the high-growth years of the 1970s and 1980s, paving the way for the country to become the 11th largest economy by gross domestic product, GDP, today, up from the 30th largest in 1975. Most recently, the World Bank introduced several initiatives to keep low-income economies from collapsing during the pandemic, including measures to increase lending and defer payments on existing external debt. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the bank formed a fund to finance the country's recovery, though experts note that an end to the war could still be years away. What do critics say about the World Bank? The plan to end world poverty shows all the pretensions of utopian social engineering. William Easterly, former World Bank economist. The bank's perceived shortcomings have come under scrutiny for decades, including from former bank officials. The plan to end world poverty shows all the pretensions of utopian social engineering, former World Bank economist William Easterly wrote in 2006. And since resigning from the World Bank in 1999, former chief economist Joseph Stiglitz has argued that the economic reforms the IMF and World Bank frequently require as conditions for their lending have often been counterproductive for recipient economies and devastating for those countries' populations. The economic consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine have battered many developing economies, reinvigorating criticism of the bank and other Western lenders. Some experts say the global nature of these crises has laid bare the bank's limitations and its obsolete rules. While rich countries issued stimulus packages to fight deteriorating economic conditions during the pandemic, low-income countries had to borrow vast sums of money to stay afloat. Yet even with historic levels of lending from the World Bank, low-income countries could afford to mobilize just a small fraction of their economies toward pandemic response, compared to over a quarter of GDP in the United States. And after the war in Ukraine sparked skyrocketing inflation, poverty and hunger increased around the world. Global education and health outcomes also suffered. In 2023, the World Bank warned of a lost decade, projecting average global economic output through 2030 would fall to a 30-year low. Worsening climate change could deepen those challenges. The World Bank estimated in 2021 that a warming planet could push an additional 132 million people into poverty. That same year, a senior UN official said the World Bank was fiddling while the developing world burns, citing its underperformance on climate action. The World Bank is the largest source of financing for climate change mitigation and adaptation projects in developing countries, yet the $31.7 billion it spent on such programs in fiscal year 2022, FY 2022, fell far short of estimates of the funding required, a report published by economists at the London School of Economics and Political Science estimated PDF in 2022 that emerging markets and developing countries, excluding China, will need to collectively spend $1.3, $1.7 trillion per year on climate needs by 2030. These include investments in renewable energy, upgrades to already strained power grids, and the phase-out of coal plants. Still, other critics argue that geopolitical considerations have made development finance more challenging. After Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the World Bank cut ties with both Russia and its ally Belarus, pausing all programs in the two countries. Meanwhile, rival investment programs, such as those affiliated with China's Belt and Road Initiative, have gained popularity as a way of financing infrastructure projects. It is increasingly difficult for the bank to fund large infrastructure projects without becoming embroiled in geopolitical rivalry, nor can it compete with massive infrastructure loans subsidized by governments motivated by geopolitical objectives, writes Scott M. Moore, a China expert and former World Bank analyst. Skeptics question whether there is still a niche for the World Bank in the modern architecture of global finance, particularly given the availability of private lending and the growth of emerging economies over the past 2 decades. Some economists have argued that the increasingly global nature of private capital flows and the ascendance of large emerging economies such as the BRICS Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa diminish the World Bank's influence. These dynamics have led some to recommend that the bank narrow its focus to countries that lack access to private markets. If the World Bank wants to have a significant role on the lending side, it's going to have to be in the poorest of the poor countries or war-torn countries where the private sector has been effectively scared off, CFR's Ben Steele said. The BRICS' new development bank and the China-led Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIIB, have presented developing countries with alternatives to the Bretton Woods institutions. Rebecca Liao, a China analyst, writes that the AIIB was born from developing world grievances with what poor countries see as the bank's onerous terms. Emerging markets including China, which the World Bank classifies as an upper-middle-income country even though it is the world's second-largest economy, have also been frustrated with their relative lack of influence at the World Bank and the IMF. But giving China in particular a greater voice in the Bretton Woods institutions is not without risks. China is not seen anymore in Congress as being a responsible player in the international financial community, Steele said at a CFR media briefing. The last thing U.S. officials want to see, he argued, is the World Bank turned into a global Belt and Road, pursuing China's geostrategic gain. To this point, some experts say the bank should reform its voting structure to be more competitive, including for its presidential elections. The United States has double the voting share of Japan, the country with the next most votes. Having an American at the helm of the bank partly served to reassure Wall Street, originally the main supplier of the bank's capital, CFR's Thomas J. Balicki wrote in 2012. With the globalization of capital markets, this justification is long outdated. He recommends a voting system that requires leaders to win over a majority of countries, not simply the primary shareholders. The bank's Board of Governors considered non-U.S. candidates in 2012, when U.S. citizen Jim Yong Kim ultimately defeated candidates from Colombia and Nigeria. However, it considered only Americans in the two subsequent nomination periods. Kim's successor, David Malpass, drew criticism for his position on climate change and resigned 1 year before his term ended. Other experts go farther, arguing that the United States should relinquish its presidency of the World Bank, especially as the U.S. share of global economic output diminishes. By allowing someone else to lead the bank, Washington would neutralize assertions from Beijing that alternative development institutions such as its own creation, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, are necessary to overcome unreasoned U.S. resistance to governance reform, writes CFR Steele. Such reforms would ensure the United States picks a World Bank president based on its policy priorities and without the restriction of nationality, while still maintaining a veto over major institutional changes. What lies ahead for the World Bank? Despite its challenges, most economists say the World Bank still serves an important role in global development. The bank itself argues that it has a number of comparative advantages over other institutions: a global presence, a repository of best practices, financial acumen, leadership in global public goods, and an established role as an international development catalyst. Several experts have proposed reforms to reorient the bank's mission in the age of climate change. In 2022, Prime Minister of Barbados Mia Mottley proposed the Bridgetown Initiative, an overhaul of the World Bank and other financial institutions that calls on wealthy countries to provide $100 billion per year in foreign exchange guarantees to low-income countries for decarbonization efforts. The plan drew support from the head of the IMF in 2022, and high-level U.S. officials, including Secretary of the Treasury Janet Yellen, endorsed the need for World Bank reforms. Mottley says she has discussed the initiative with World Bank President Bunga, but he has not officially backed it. For his part, Bunga has proposed plans to expand the World Bank's lending by $100 billion over the next decade. His reforms would allow bank shareholders, including the United States and other wealthy countries, to guarantee loans if countries cannot repay them. At a CFR meeting in September 2023, Bunga said he intends to stretch the bank's balance sheet with all the financial engineering I can do. The bank has previously said such maneuvers could increase lending six-fold over a 10-year period. Still, Steele says that China and other rapidly growing economies at some point will need to assume responsibility for their own people, given their economic growth. He argues that rather than loaning large sums of money, the World Bank's primary role in the years ahead could instead lie in the advisory assistance it provides. Thank you for watching this video.